Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 38. Last episode, I introduced the subject of ecology, and I mentioned the 5 levels of scale that ecologists use to study the world. These levels begin with the behavioral ecology of the individual organism, then the population ecology of groups or herds or swarms, then the community ecology of multiple different species all interacting together in a large area. The last levels are the ecosystem ecology of species interacting with their abiotic environment, and the sum total global ecology of the world's biosphere. The subsequent episodes in this series on ecology will cover these different levels, starting today with behavioral ecology. Before I get into the details of studying behavioral ecology, I have to define what it is that scientists mean when they say behavior. You might think it obvious, but essentially an organism's behavior are the actions that it makes in response to stimuli. When the organism is hungry, it seeks out food, and so the behavioral ecologist looks at how the organism goes about acquiring food. What foods does it eat? How does it get it? What physiological mechanisms does it use to chew and ingest the food? That kind of stuff. When the organism seeks shelter, it burrows a hole, or builds a nest, or a web, or a hive. Or it makes a dam, or a mound, something to protect it from the harsh exterior environment, from predators, and from those that would steal their stored food or their eggs. The behavioral ecologist looks at how the organism interacts with other members of its species, whether it be in an aggressive confrontation or competition, a cooperative effort to hunt or migrate, or how the organisms communicate to each other to indicate the direction of a food source or the location of a predator. These are all behaviors, whether it's a human doing it, or a fox, or a fish, or an insect, or a bear, or a bird, or whatever. I'm listing animals here, but I should also mention that plants exhibit behaviors too. The sunflower, turning to face the sun as it moves across the sky, is a behavior, as is the Venus flytrap clamping down on some poor little bug. That's also a behavior. Scientists generally study behavior in animals, though, as opposed to plants, because animals are able to give much faster, more obvious responses to stimuli. Plants move slowly, over the course of hours and days and weeks, but animals respond the moment you do something, like offer them food or make a threatening gesture. Behavior is a really complex, dynamic, multidimensional thing, and we can never really know what an animal is thinking or what its life experience is like. The best we can do is try to contextualize the behaviors as inclusively as possible by asking the right kind of questions. Since 1961, behavioral ecologists have tried to understand an organism's behavior by asking 2 kinds of questions: proximate questions and ultimate questions. Proximate questions are those that address the proximate causation of the organism's behavior, with respect to the nitty-gritty physiological and mechanical details involving genes, hormones, muscles, skeletons, and neural systems. For example, if you were to look at the sense of smell in a great white shark, the proximate question that you might ask is, how does the shark have such a potent sense of smell? And the answer would involve details about the shark's enlarged olfactory bulb in its brain, or its nasal cavity, which is used exclusively for smelling stuff, where a human nasal cavity is used for both smelling and breathing. These are all proximate details to a proximate question. Ultimate questions and ultimate causations, as the name suggests, address at the less technical and more big-picture perspective. The ultimate questions seek to understand why certain traits or behaviors happen in an evolutionary context. In the case of the shark, is having such a profoundly effective sense of smell helpful to their survival? The question might be, why does the shark have such a good sense of smell? Does it serve an evolutionary purpose? In this case, with the sharks and their sense of smell, the answer is an obvious yes. Yes, it does. It helps with their evolution, with their adaptation, with their fitness. Another ultimate question would address the evolutionary origin of the shark's sense of smell, which perhaps evolved as part of their specialization as a predator in a literal ocean environment, where the nearest food may be miles away. Being able to detect the faintest traces of food becomes really important when everything is so spread out and it takes a long time to make a major kill. In such circumstances, a string of unsuccessful hunts can lead to starvation, so the shark has endured a strong evolutionary pressure to be able to successfully track down prey at great distances. This is part of something called optimal foraging, which I'll get into later in the episode. Anyway, as I said a moment ago, behaviors are dynamic. They're complex. Some behaviors are flexible, while others aren't. This is another way of organizing behavior based on their flexibility, or you can also organize them based on the required amount of learning that it takes to possess that skill or that behavior. Flexibility is the capacity of the behavior to have variation in its expression or its utility. For example, in human beings, the sneeze and the yawn are two innate behaviors with low flexibility. Pretty much all people have sneezes and yawns. Pretty much all their sneezes and yawns are the same. Sneezes might sound different from person to person, but the physical mechanism of rapid air expulsion to clear the nose and throat is the same. Likewise, yawning might be louder or quieter, longer or shorter, depending on the person and the moment and the particular yawn, but the physical mechanism of an almost unstoppable urge to open the mouth and let out a slow, exhaling yawn is the same from person to person. These are called fixed action patterns because they show no flexibility. They're fixed responses to certain stimuli. Yawning is interesting because it's a physical response that's caused by being tired, or by being bored, or just by seeing someone else yawn. Fixed action patterns exist in all kinds of species. When a kangaroo rat makes a backwards jump in an attempt to escape from some startling event or a predator or something, that's a fixed action pattern. The various rituals and mating dances that male birds perform in the presence of female birds, those are also fixed action patterns. The other part of behaviors that I mentioned are their capacity to be learned, or the amount of learning that goes into developing that behavior. Speech is a great example of a learned behavior. It's a flexible behavior too, because speech can be used for a huge variety of purposes. You use speech to discuss ideas and to negotiate, to communicate on a project and cooperate with teammates, to discourage an attacker and to romance a lover. Speech is both learned and flexible, which puts it at the opposite of both spectrums from sneezing and yawning, which are both inflexible and innate. An innate behavior means that the behavior isn't learned. You don't learn to sneeze or to yawn, you instinctively know how to do it. You can do it from birth, basically. Babies sneeze, babies yawn. It's literally a behavior encoded in your DNA. This is a trend that holds true for most behaviors. Those that are innate are also generally inflexible, while those that are learned are often much more flexible. And that makes sense intuitively, because in the process of learning a skill or a behavior, there's the inevitable emergence of permutations and specialized styles. With all their learned and innate, flexible and inflexible behaviors, the animal generally has a number of responses to certain situations. The animal perceives stimuli from its environment. It perceives the things that it can see and hear and smell, the things that are all happening around it. And based on these things, based on these sensory inputs and the information processing going on in its brain, it makes decisions. And as far as we can tell, the animal makes choices that prioritize its survival, and then the survival of its immediate offspring. The animal makes an instinctive cost-benefit analysis of its situation. It doesn't sit there and consciously weigh out pros and cons. It has a more unconscious, intuitive sense of what it should do. Think like a deer that is eating leaves when it sees a predator approaching, but the predator is at a great distance. The deer has to decide, do I leave now and keep the distance advantage between the predator and me, but abandon all of these tasty leaves? Or do I stay here, chewing on the leaves for a few more minutes before I decide to leave, even though that'll get me a little bit closer to this predator? Or do I stay here eating tasty leaves until I can hear the predator creeping around near me before trying to make a dashing escape? There are pros and cons, benefits and risks involved with every choice. And the deer has to weigh these costs and benefits before making its decision. It has to weigh the cost of leaving a food source versus the benefit of avoiding a predator. In this case, it seems obvious that the deer should leave as soon as possible. After all, it has food everywhere, but avoiding predators is generally a more effective policy when it's consistently followed. Another example of a cost-benefit analysis is the shark, which must decide whether the scent it detects is worth following all the way to the source. And again, these are examples of optimal foraging. So with that out of the way, it's time for me to explore 5 aspects of animal behavior. First and foremost, an animal must eat. It must find food and feed itself to sustain its life. Second, it needs a place to live, or a place with reliable food that it can come back to and, feed from. Or at the very least, it needs a place to reproduce with a modicum of safety. Third, the animal needs ways to communicate with other members of its species, whether to warn them about a predator or to entice a mate for reproduction. And fourth, it needs to know when to cooperate to maximize its benefit. Lastly, the animal must find a suitable mate and reproduce, so as to pass on their genes to the next generation, to perpetuate their genes through time with another pulse of the organic chemical wave. Okay, so I'll start with the first aspect I mentioned, which is how an animal feeds itself. When an animal searches for food, it's exhibiting a behavior called foraging. A bird that's digging through the dirt for seeds or a worm to eat is foraging. So is an insect flying around for the right kind of plant to eat, or the wolf pack tracking and hunting a moose, and the alligator floating motionless in the swamp with its mouth open, waiting for its prey to wander too close. Whatever tactics they use, animals try to forage efficiently. In fact, they try to maximize their efficiency, foraging in ways that optimize the amount of energy and edible material they can consume versus the amount of energy that they have to expend to get it. The hypothesis is that animals use foraging techniques to max out this efficiency. Optimal foraging strategies depend on things like the food being eaten, the environment it's in, and the ambient threat of predators. When a bird delicately picks seeds one by one out of the dirt, it's exhibiting a basic kind of optimized foraging. By spending a little time focusing on finding each individual seed and picking it up cleanly, one at a time, the bird can find and eat seeds at a slow but relatively constant rate. Hypothetically, it could just gulp down mouthfuls of dirt, and it would eat any seeds that happen to be in there. But that has a lot of negative consequences to it. Like first and foremost, stuffing the stomach full of dirt. These are proximate consequences with proximate explanations. The dirt is indigestible to the bird's enzymes. The dirt would physically clog its intestinal tract. The dirt would fill up its belly before it had eaten enough seeds, and so on and so forth. An ultimate analysis of this would suggest that those birds who didn't bother to avoid eating dirt suffered more because of it, and they were eventually selected against by the merciless forces of evolution until they all died out. And the only birds that were left were those whose behaviors were hardwired to patiently pick out seeds one by one. Consider these other aspects of optimal foraging. Maritime birds that eat oysters will optimize their foraging by going after oysters of medium size. The smaller oysters have weak muscles, and they can be easily opened and eaten. It doesn't take much effort, and it's not very time intensive to open up these small oysters. But because they're small, they don't have much meat in them, and so they don't offer that much in the way of chemical energy. They don't really have that many calories. There's not much of a payoff. So even though the bird can open them easily, it's not really getting much of a reward from it. On the other hand, you have the larger oysters, which have stronger muscles and thicker shells, and the birds have to expend a lot of time and energy getting them open. Sometimes this can be so frustrating and so difficult that the bird actually damages its beak or its talons against the hard shell of the oyster. The birds generally don't bother with the larger oysters because despite the heavier mass of meat, the larger amount of calories and energy inside of them, they're just too energy intensive to focus on. It's like, yeah, you can spend all this energy trying to open up a large oyster, but by the time you get it open, there might not be enough calories in there to replace what you burned trying to get to it. And this is even worse if it takes you a long time to do it and you're exposed to predators while you're trying to open up this oyster and you hurt your beak while you're trying to do it too. I mean, all of these are just compiling negative consequences that would discourage a bird from trying to eat the larger oyster. That's why these shorebirds go after medium-sized oysters. The medium-sized oysters give a decent nutritional payout, a good amount of chemical energy, calories, and they don't require that much energy to open either. So by focusing on these medium-sized oysters, their foraging is optimized. Another example is the Antarctic seals that eat krill. The krill exist in patches of various sizes and densities, at various depths in the ocean water. It takes more energy for the seal to dive deeper and to stay down longer, but by staying down longer, the seal can potentially eat more krill. This generally depends on the density of the krill patch, because if you have a sparse cloud of krill at great depths, it's generally not worthwhile for the seal. It would have to dive deep down, and then it would have to swim around a lot to catch all of these spread out krill. It wouldn't really get a decent meal. It's spending too much energy. It might have to dive down, take a few bites of krill, and then come back up and generally just find a more accessible patch. It's not worth the energy to swim around and try and collect all these krill because they're just not giving the seal that much energy in return. But if that deep krill swarm was really dense, if it wasn't spread out, it was compact and dense, then the seal would stay down for longer, despite the greater energy expenditure of being at such a depth, as it could easily eat a lot of krill in the dense patch without having to swim around too much. The depth and the duration of the seal's dive is optimized to match the difficulty of access and the density of the krill patch. This kind of optimization sees the animal use its time spent foraging as efficiently as possible, as its foraging behaviors will generally expose the animal to predators and use up energy of its own. If the animal can gather a lot of chemical energy without spending too much of its own or without overly risking itself to predation, that animal has an optimized foraging strategy that's going to put it at an evolutionary advantage. It's a foraging strategy that may persist for countless generations and become a hallmark characteristic of that species' behavior. Alright, on to the next aspect. Where do animals choose to live? Where do they choose to dwell? Do they live with their parents? Or do they migrate away after adolescence to find a new place to live? How do groups of animals know where to migrate as the seasons change? What are the benefits of migrating as opposed to staying in place? To answer all of these questions, first we have to look at the proximate causes behind animal movement through an environment. There are 3 types of proximal navigation, called piloting, compass orientation, and true navigation. Piloting is the simplest type of navigation, as it involves the basic recognition of landmarks and the usage of memorized pathways or travel corridors through the area. You use piloting to get around your city, or your school, or your place of work. You know where Bob's cubicle is and the water fountain is near there, or you know that the bathroom is down the hallway to the left. Whatever it happens to be, you understand the landmarks and the geography of the area, and you can use your understanding of this spatial area to just navigate your way through it. Animals do this much the same way, but they use rivers and mountains and forests and cities and all sorts of things as their landmarks. For example, when a child bird is taken on a migration by its parent, the child bird is seeing all of the landmarks that they pass over, and after 1 or 2 migrations, the child bird has memorized the route and can take it by itself. This is just basic piloting. Compass orientation is a bit more complicated because it involves moving variables like the sun, which rises in the east and sets in the west. The light input from the sun, in combination with the animal's internal circadian rhythm, is often enough for the animal to figure out where north is. It sees the sun at some point in the sky, it kind of has an intuitive sense of what time of day it is, and it can combine these 2 pieces of information to figure out where north is. Many species of migratory birds use both the position of the sun and the position of the stars to determine their orientation, such as the North Star. When the North Star can't be seen, like on a cloudy night or during the day, these migratory birds can actually sense the Earth's magnetic field, and they use that to orient themselves. Research into this is still ongoing, but it seems clear now that birds have the ability to visually perceive the magnetic field as if it were a visible wavelength of light, and they have some kind of magnetite-containing organ in their beaks that can sense magnetic fields. Green sea turtles also navigate and migrate in the oceans by sensing the magnetosphere. In fact, many species use some kind of compass to orient themselves, be it the sun, the stars, or the Earth's magnetic field. The 3rd type of navigation is called map orientation, or true navigation, and it involves the ability to find a specific location over and over again. The green sea turtles that I mentioned a moment ago use the magnetosphere to help them navigate. They can somehow sense the differences in the Earth's magnetic field, the angles and the various intensities of it, and they use these differences that they can sense in the magnetic field to get a grasp on where they are geospatially, geographically. Experiments have shown that these turtles can swim around entire oceans, visiting the coastlines of multiple continents, before returning to a specific location to feed or to mate. The turtles use their awareness of the magnetic field to approximate their location, and they navigate on a global scale, and it allows them to come back to specific home locations after spending months or years across the Pacific or the Atlantic or wherever they happen to live. That's an amazing skill to have, and it reminds me of the various salmon species that somehow find the river of their birth. They swim back up it, and they mate in the same lagoon or pond that their parents mated in, and that they were born in. Somehow, after swimming around the ocean for years, the salmon can return to the exact river they were born in, and they continue the reproductive cycle by mating and dying in it just like their parents did. What are the ultimate causes behind migration and navigation? For this particular aspect of animal behavior, the ultimate causes are simple and relatively obvious. Take a look at any migrating species, and you'll see that it's chasing one or both of two things: food or good mating conditions. The elk that roam Siberia and the northern reaches of North America, they migrate in response to the seasons. Not because they can't handle the cold weather, they can, but because their food sources are more accessible in climates with less snow cover and more plant-friendly temperatures. Salmon migrate out of freshwater lakes and streams at a certain point in their growth cycle because they can get more food in the saltwater ocean, and this lets them grow larger. The larger salmon are stronger and more likely to successfully make it back up the stream of their birth to reproduce. Monarch butterflies are a famous example of a migrating species, and their migration is amazing and extremely fascinating. During the summer, the monarch butterflies exist all over much of North America, but during the fall, they begin to migrate southwards, where they spend the winter in the warm mountains of central Mexico. In the spring, they begin the northward journey once more. The entire migration from north to south can take multiple lifetimes. The monarch butterflies literally reproduce en route, and their offspring continue the migration in their place. In effect, the whole migratory circuit consists of the entire species moving back and forth in response to the seasons, with the species trying to perpetually follow the comfortable, temperate climate band that exists between the cold of a Canadian winter and the heat of a Mexican summer. The third aspect of animal behavior is communication. This is any process through which the animal conveys information to another individual, or sends some kind of signal that causes a reaction or a response in the receiving individual. Methods of communication can be both intraspecies and interspecies. An intraspecies example of communication, just off the top of my head, would be like a prairie dog making a warning noise to its fellow prairie dogs that a predator is near. Or like a bee making a signaling dance to the other bees in its hive. Or a songbird that sings in order to attract a mate. Intraspecies communication between individuals of the same species can be pretty complicated, pretty nuanced, and context-sensitive. Interspecies communication, on the other hand, tends to be less sophisticated, much rarer, almost exclusively confined to confrontational encounters. You can think of interspecies communication as like a pack of wolves that are growling at a bear because the bear is encroaching on their kill. They're telling the bear to back off with the most fundamental body language that they can. Humans are pretty much the only organisms that communicate non-confrontationally with other animals. We'll talk soothingly or in a relaxing tone to our pets, to our dogs and cats, to birds. Although it's arguable if you could really call this communication, because for it to be true communication, the receiving individual, or in this case the animal, has to kind of have a clue about what we're saying or what message we're trying to convey. Not even all of our pets understand this. You can say a word to your dog, and the dog may understand the word, or they may understand what the sound means. So if you say, "Hey, let's go to the park," the dog doesn't know what the park is, but it knows that when you make that sound, "Let's go to the park," it knows that it's going to go outside and get to play around, and it likes that, and so it's happy. Its response is joy. But if you were to tell that to the cat probably doesn't care. The cat won't respond. It'll just look at you and be like, "Why are you making noise at me?" And then if you say something to an alligator at the zoo, you can barely call that communication because the alligator has no idea what you're saying. It has no idea that you're even trying to interact with it, really. It just thinks you're hollering making noise somewhere near it, and it's not going to respond to you. I want to look more in depth at the dancing communication of honeybees, because the way honeybees talk is just ridiculously fascinating. So get this, inside of a beehive, it's pretty much totally dark. The bees aren't using vision to interact with one another, because they can't see each other, there's just no light. But they can feel each other. They can recognize the location and the movement of other bees by touching them and feeling their vibrations and the direction of their travel or the vibrations that they leave in the air. Because of this dependence on the sense of touch, bees have evolved a kind of dance as a form of communication. In this dance, the bee that's speaking, or dancing I suppose, will move in a circular pattern. Sometimes these circular patterns are interrupted by straight stretches where the bee bisects the circle that it's making by wiggling or vibrating its body while it's going down this straight run. Research that started in the 1930s has found that bees can communicate messages by altering the direction and the length of the straight run. To be specific, the circular dance is used to communicate the presence of food to the rest of the hive. The bee that found the food returns to the hive and they do this little dance on the wall where many other bees can feel what's happening. The bee runs in circles, marking the hive as the start point, or as like the origin on a coordinate map. Then the dancing bee will bisect these circles with a straight run and a waggle of their abdomen. So they're running in circles, and then they'll take a sharp turn and run in a straight line. And as they run in a straight line, they'll waggle or vibrate their abdomen really intensely so other bees can feel it. The direction of this straight run indicates the direction of the food that the bee has found. And second, the magnitude or the length of this straight run tells the other bees just how far away from the hive that this food is. If the food is close, the dancing bee will make a short waggle run, and the other bees will know that food is nearby in whichever direction, while a longer waggle run indicates that the food is farther away. What's more, the bees orient their dance in relation to the sun. Because the bee does their dance on the wall of the hive, they can move left and right and up and down. If the bee makes its straight run directly down towards the floor of the hive, this tells the other bees that the food is directly away from the sun. It tells the bees that they'll have the sun on their backs as they fly to the food source. They can also make their waggle run to the left or right, perpendicular to the vertical, which tells the other bees that the food source is left or right relative to the sun. In this way, the bees are literally able to use the sense of touch to perceive and comprehend an angle displayed on a vertical surface, and they can translate that angle into movement across a horizontal plane as the bees go fly out in search of the food. That's really incredible. Further research has found that bees don't just use their sense of touch to interpret the dance, but they also use a complex system of sounds and scents, and this gives further details as to the type of food or any associated conditions like nearby competitors or predators. So these are all the proximate details, but what about the ultimate details? As with migrating and navigating, the ultimate causes are rather obvious. An effective mode of communication has sufficient complexity to be able to convey detailed messages, like the location and nature of a food source. This complexity allows the location of food to be accurately communicated, and it allows more worker bees to find and harvest food. More food and more nutrients for the colony means that it can grow and support a larger population, and better feed the current bees. The evolutionary benefit here is obvious. Another ultimate cause behind the bees' dance would be the environment that necessitated a tactile mode of communication in the first place. The bees live in a dark hive, where light isn't always present, and vision isn't particularly useful. This evolutionary context would have provided the pressure for bees to evolve a tactile, sound, and scent-based communication system. In fact, many species that live and hunt in the darkness use sounds and scents to communicate instead of visual cues. Wolves hunt at night, and they communicate with a variety of howls, barks, and growls, and yips that convey information, like the location of prey or fellow hunters, or the presence of a trap or a threat. I should also say that the bees are entirely honest in their communication. The bees don't really lie. Like, you won't have a drone come in and lie about where food is. You know, he won't try and intentionally misdirect his fellow drones, because that only puts him at risk too. If all the drones waste energy going out where there's no food, and they come back starved and depleted of energy with no food to, bring themselves back up to health, they're kind of putting themselves in a risky situation. They're putting the whole hive in a risky situation. But this isn't to say that all communication is honest. A lot of animal communication is deceitful, intended to mimic a mating cry to lure in a prey animal, or intended to misdirect or aggravate an animal so that it goes off and does something else, leaving the deceiver free to do whatever he wants, like steal eggs or food or something. If you look at speech in humans, which is also a form of communication, speech is obviously communication. I'm speaking to you now and I'm communicating ideas to you now. Humans can also be deceitful with their speech. This is pretty obvious. I'm telling you the truth right now. I'm just giving you facts about biology and talking about biology because I think it's cool and fascinating. But say we were friends, and I accidentally broke something that you hold valuable, and I didn't want you to know that I broke it, so I lied and said, I don't know how that broke. Or I blamed it on another mutual friend. I said, Tom over there broke it. It's his fault. You should go talk to him about it. Speech in humans is flexible enough that it can be used not just for honesty and conveyance of information, but for deceit, for trickery, for obfuscation, for propaganda. While quite a bit of human communication is based on deceit or based on some kind of trickery or obfuscation, communication also goes hand in hand with cooperation. You need to communicate to cooperate, to exchange information that all parties can use. And when you cooperate, you both get a benefit. When workers on a team cooperate, they accomplish their goal, and all the workers on the team get the benefits of accomplishing the goal. Cooperation is the fourth aspect of animal behavior that I want to cover. Cooperation can also be called altruism, which is a strange and arguably contradictory behavior seen in nature, wherein one individual does something at risk or cost to itself, but that benefits or protects another individual. Altruism is contradictory because when you look at it in evolutionary terms, altruism lowers the fitness of the acting animal, but it increases the fitness of the animal that's helped by the act of altruism. There are several explanations as to why animals may engage in altruism, even though it might put them at a risk or a disadvantage, and I'll briefly run through these. First, there's the kin selection hypothesis, which argues that altruism may exist between genetically related individuals as a means of promoting the family's genes. If an uncle doesn't have kids of his own, but he helps to raise his nieces and nephews, his altruism, where he lost the fitness benefit of having his own kids, but he's helping his brother's kids or his sister's kids, he benefits by helping propel his family's genes forward another generation. This can also be seen in a community of prairie dogs, where one individual will often shout out a warning that a predator is nearby, like a lynx or a hawk. But by shouting, by making that alerting noise, that prairie dog will expose themselves to the predator. It's like saying, hey, here I am, I'm right here. They're distracting the predator to pay attention to them so that all the other prairie dogs can escape. They protect the others at risk to themselves. In cases like this, animals are much more likely to risk themselves if the other individuals they're protecting are close relatives. This not only preserves their family's genes, on a greater level, it preserves the alleles that promote this kind of self-sacrificing altruistic behavior. Some altruism isn't so selfless. Some altruism can actually be selfish. This is called cooperation when it's conducted between individuals of the same species, and mutualism when it's conducted between individuals of different species. In both cases, each individual benefits from the interaction. For example, hyenas and wolves and other pack predators, they cooperate together by hunting in packs, where they can trap and kill prey that are either too fast or too large for just one individual to handle. If you imagine one wolf hunting by itself, it'll have a limited capacity to hunt and capture prey. It almost certainly won't be able to take down a moose by itself. But if you have that wolf hunting in a pack with a dozen other wolves, they can start engaging in complex strategies to corner the moose, or they can all jump up on the moose and tackle it all at once, and their combined weight and the combined damage of all their teeth and claws, the moose won't be able to resist. It won't be able to fight them all off. There's another example where birds will sit on a larger animal, like an elephant or a hippopotamus or a giraffe or an alligator or something, and they engage in mutualist altruism by picking parasites or bugs off their hide, or in the case of alligators and hippopotamus, by picking out gunk from between their teeth. This is mutualism because everybody benefits. The bird gets a bunch of tasty snacks, whether it be parasites or food gunk that it pulled out of the spaces between teeth. And the larger animal gets a benefit because it's getting cleaned. Both species benefit. It's mutualism. Another hypothesis is that some animal societies have an element of manipulative or coercive leadership that enforces altruistic behavior. Consider the bees I've been talking about. These worker bees, who find food and who make their little dance messages, they're being very altruistic. They're essentially burning out their life energy working for the hive, specifically for the queen and her offspring. There's an element of kin selection here, as the bees in a single hive are pretty closely related. Maybe they all come from the queen. They're all the queen's daughters. But some bee queens are known to mate with multiple males, and they have a greater genetic diversity within their hives. There's less relation between the drones, and thus there's less incentive for them to be altruistic to the queen. In response, the queen and her close relatives will use pheromones to try and suppress the mating behavior in the drones. And if these pheromones aren't enough, and the drones still lay eggs, the queen and her cronies will outright destroy them. They'll do this, basically killing the babies of their chemical work slaves, until the drones just give up, until they don't even bother trying to invest the energy to make and lay an egg anymore. In effect, the bee's altruism is actually a kind of coerced, forced chemical slavery. It's like using pheromone chemicals to put people into a stupor. And when they're in this exploitable stupor or this trance, you just have them do whatever you want them to do for you. You kind of don't really give a crap about their life. You don't even give a crap about their kids or their offspring because you're going around killing their eggs. You just want them to serve you. It's kind of creepy. But on the opposite end of the spectrum, there's something called reciprocal altruism, which is present in longer-lived species of social animals. In reciprocal altruism, the animal is working with a do good deeds and pass it on kind of mentality. Being altruistic in these long-lived social communities is more likely to get other individuals to be altruistic towards you. Put more simply, if you help someone, they're more likely to help you out later on. This is a kind of altruism that's spread out through time, where good deeds don't necessarily offer immediate benefits, but instead cultivate stronger social bonds that will encourage other individuals to return the altruism. This has been seen in numerous species, like vampire bats, where the successful hunters of the night will share a bit of their blood meal with the hungry, less successful hunters, under the assumption that if one night in the future those successful hunters are themselves unsuccessful, they'll be able to count on the rest of the members in their pack or their flock or whatever you want to call the group of bats to be altruistic to them and give them some blood so they don't starve. You can also see this with various species of primate, like lemurs or baboons or chimps or whatever, which groom unrelated individuals or share food in the expectation of receiving similar altruism when they need it in the future. You might notice a lot of similarities between how animals act with reciprocal altruism and how human societies are organized. In fact, pretty much our entire economy, our modern advanced civilization, is based on this concept of reciprocal altruism. It's kind of like, I'll make a good or provide a service, and you'll pay me back money. And if I can show you that I do a good job, we'll cultivate a social relationship. And you'll have faith in me that I'll do a good job. And if you pay me on time, I'll have faith in you that you'll pay me on time. And we'll be more likely to work together in the future. We'll be more likely to cultivate a business relationship and grow our businesses or, whatever happens to be. I'm looking at this right now through an economic perspective, but you can easily, just think about it, and you can easily see how reciprocal altruism applies to politics, how it applies to resource distribution, how it applies to education, to almost any aspect of human civilization. Reciprocal altruism kind of plays an integral, motivating part. The last aspect of animal behavior that I want to talk about today is mate selection and reproduction. The act of mating is typically preceded by a flush of sex hormones. In some species, like the Anolis lizard, the gonads grow in size in response to a surge of sex hormones, testosterone in the males and estradiol in the females. When the growth of the gonads reaches their maximum in the midsummer, the lizard's breeding season begins, and the males and females go at it like crazy. The males spend all winter building up testosterone in preparation for the breeding season, only for their testosterone levels to crash immediately after the summer is over. It turns out that the seasonal changes themselves, with their associated changes in temperature and light level, are the chronological triggers that help regulate the cycle of sex hormones. Additionally, the female anolis lizard wouldn't enter their breeding phase unless they were courted by fertile males. As part of their mating ritual, as the males create more and more testosterone, they extend a brightly colored flap of tissue that exists under their jaw, called a dewlap, and they bob this dewlap up and down as a kind of mating signal. They'll extend it and then they'll bob their head up and down. Seeing this dewlap bobbing up and down has been experimentally proven to be a visual cue that arouses the female lizard and initiates estradiol production. So a combination of incoming spring-like climate conditions and being exposed to males with increasing testosterone levels and bobbing dewlaps is enough to raise female estradiol levels and initiate the breeding season. On an ultimate level, sexual selection is used to identify healthy mates. The female invests a disproportionate amount of energy and resources into her offspring, so it follows that she's choosier in who she mates with. She doesn't want to invest time and resources into a weak child that she has with a weak male. The female needs some kind of sign or signal from the male that he's healthy and fertile before she'll choose to mate with him. This is much like the tail of a peacock, which requires a lot of nutrients and care in order to keep clean and to look presentable. So a peacock with a brilliant and shiny tail display is basically telling the female peacock, look, I'm strong enough and healthy enough to be able to get enough food to maintain this plumage, which means I have good genes and I have good fitness and I'll be a good mate. In the case of the anolis lizard, the size and color of the dewlap is directly correlated with the bite strength and physical vitality of the male. Males with larger dewlaps are generally better fighters, better able to defend their territory. In fact, female lizards are more likely to choose a mate based on his ability to defend his territory than they are based on his ability to woo them by bobbing the dewlap up and down. This is because while having a big dewlap that you can wave around may look pretty, being able to defend your territory offers material advantages that improves fitness, like a stable habitat full of food with little to no competition. If the male can provide that reliable food and that safety for the female, she's going to be much more likely to choose him as a mate, even if he doesn't necessarily have the brightest, biggest dewlap. As you can see, there's a lot of variety in the ways that animals behave, and there's a lot of nuance and complexity in even the smallest gestures and movements. Animal behavior is a complex, multifaceted phenomenon, and studying animal behaviors requires considering both proximate and ultimate influences. I hope you enjoyed this episode on behavioral ecology, and I hope it gave you a lot of interesting things to think about and consider. Learning about ecology really changed the way that I see the world. It changed the way that I see interactions and even human society. And I hope that by teaching you about ecology, I can make that happen for you as well. As always, thanks for listening.
Would you like to support the BioLogic podcast? It's super easy. When you open a new episode, press the like button or share it with your friends. If you aren't subscribed, you should hit the subscribe button so you can enjoy a new episode every week. You can also peruse our official store, which has a ton of cool stuff like hand-designed t-shirts, hoodies, and stickers. All the links you need are in the description section below.